This episode of Felon is brought to you by the good people at Marley Spoon, who are changing the way you cook. If you're unfamiliar with Marley Spoon, put simply, they're a meal kit delivery service. They create simple recipes and source local ingredients, conveniently delivering it straight to your door. You get to choose all the recipes that you want to cook, so it's suited to your exact tastes. When ordering your Marley Spoon meals, you can choose your own weekly menu from 16 recipes. It's not just meat or veggie boxes with the same recipes every week. At Marley Spoon, they source the ingredients from local farmers, so the produce is incredibly fresh, top quality, and sustainably sourced. Every recipe takes 6 steps, can be cooked in 30 minutes, and they all taste amazing. As a special offer to Australian listeners, head to marleyspoon.com.au, that's marleyspoon.com.au, and enter the code FELON, all capitals, to get $35 off your first delivery. With Marley Spoon, you can cook better and live smarter.
G'day viewers, I've just been telling the Yanks how Australia is the best place for a holiday and the friendliest place on earth. The beaches are crisp and clean, beer's cold, and there's plenty of shrimps on the bar. The least we can do is make sure everyone's smiling. I'm not asking you to rent out the spare bedroom or anything, just flash the pearly whites and say g'day to a visitor. G'day.
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 Come on, don't make a liar out of me.
Welcome to Felon, Season 2, Episode 3, The Backpacker Murders. In 1993, 7 skeletons had been discovered in a state forest near Bowral, in the southern highlands of New South Wales. The realisation of Australia's worst solo serial killer and the uncovering of a killing ground would stun a small community, and the news would ricochet internationally, transforming the attitude of potential visitors to Australia for years to come. Murder is the apex of megalomania, the ultimate in control. Lucy Freeman. His jovial persona screeches to a halt in unison with the vehicle, revealing someone else completely. The tables turn. He's no longer welcoming, helpful, and friendly. Rather, controlling, agitated, filled with hate. Fear plumes from his passengers like smoke, filling every space in the car. He longs to inflict paralysis, revel in their helplessness, to gain complete control. Late January 1980, a 20-year-old university student, who is referred to as David, was making his way back to his home in Redland Bay in Queensland after spending New Year's near Newcastle, New South Wales. It was late afternoon, and David was walking on the outskirts of Hexham, trying to decide whether to find somewhere to stay or to go further. An American-looking farm ute pulled up beside him, and the driver offered him a ride. David accepted and threw his backpack in the rear tray and climbed into the front seat with the driver. David described the driver as having dark wavy hair and a moustache. He also remembers that as soon as he got in the vehicle, he had a bad vibe, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. David recounted the experience as the following. He didn't say much to begin with, but we started driving, and straight away he started putting down hitchhikers. He said, "They don't respect you. They are never thankful when you give them a lift, and if you don't give them a lift, they abuse you." With this, David offered to be dropped off, but the driver kept going, noticeably agitated, for around 2 more hours. I asked him to pull over a number of times so I could find a place to stay, and I grew anxious. We started to go uphill, and there were no more lights, so I knew that we were away from civilization. He turned right onto a dirt road, and I remember that because the sound of the gravel, and I was getting ready to fight or run. 20 minutes later, he pulled up and said, "Get out, my camp's near here." David exited the vehicle, and the driver carried on, leaving David on the side of the road. David grew concerned that the driver was going to come back. In his words, there was bush on both sides of the road, and a voice in my head was saying, Get higher than the road so you can see him if he comes back. I stashed my backpack because of its reflectors and found a tree about 50 metres from the road that I could sit with my back to under the canopy of bush. He came back about 20 minutes later. The vehicle pulled up and he walked around in front of the headlights, carrying a rifle, looking up and down the banks. He got back in the vehicle, and about 10 minutes later, he was back with a torch, shining a light on both sides of the road and into the bush. I stayed in the same place all night, waiting for the sun to come up. The following day, David was rescued by a passing truck after stepping out in front of it and waving the vehicle down. The driver offered to take him to the police station, but he didn't report the incident. To this day, he is unsure of the identity of the mysterious driver, but the events that would soon follow would add a sinister element to his already disturbing tale. In the late 80s and early 90s, Tourism Australia ran a series of advertising campaigns with the intention of enticing international tourists to visit Australia. The ads often featured local celebrities spruiking the landmarks of the land down under and insisting it was the friendliest place on earth. Many young travellers flocked to Australia, but when faced with travel costs and navigating across the great southern land, they often resorted to hitchhiking. Many were greeted with open arms and Australian hospitality, and they were helped along their way. Some were not so lucky. May 1992, British backpackers Joanne Leslie Walters, 22, and Caroline Clark, 21, met at a backpackers hostel in Sydney and teamed up with the aim of looking for work picking fruit. Joanne had dark hair with big brown eyes, with a young face and infectious smile. She was visiting from Wales. Caroline came from Northumberland in the UK. She was described as being pretty, with brown hair and a small build. In photos, the girls have packs strapped to their backs. They look hopeful, excited, and ready to take on the adventure of their lifetime, backpacking around a beautiful, unfamiliar country. They had plans to see the Northern Territory, Ayers Rock, and the Nullarbor Plain in the Western Australian desert, and so, with packs on their back, maps in hand, they made their way into the unknown. In September 1992, a bushwalker taking part in an orienteering event stumbled across two bodies in an area known as Executioner's Drop in the Blanglo State Forest. The bodies were soon identified as being Joanne and Caroline, who had gone missing 5 months prior. Joanne had been stabbed at least 14 times, 5 of these severing her spinal cord. The forensic examiner determined that these could have paralysed the young woman before the rest of the frenzied attack was carried out. The zip of her jeans was undone, with the button still fastened, suggesting a hasty sexual assault. 2 ribs had been totally severed. Her hands and arms showed no defensive wounds, and there were signs of a ligature around her neck. The killer had been completely in control of the attack. Caroline Clark's injuries differed from her friends, suggesting to police at the time that there had been more than one attacker. A decaying red cloth joined her wrists where they were stretched up above her head. 10 bullet holes riddled her skull, and the face and jaw were shattered. Similar to Joanne, 1 stab wound had been inflicted on her upper back, severing the spinal cord and possibly paralysing her before she was used as target practice, according to police. Despite the amount of forensic evidence, police made little headway in the weeks following the discovery of Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark. But almost a year later, in October 1993, the badly decomposed remains of missing Australian backpackers James Gibson and Deborah Everest, both only 19 years old, were uncovered by a man collecting firewood in the Blanglo State Forest. The location was just 600 metres from where the first bodies were found. James and Deborah had been missing since December of 1989. James fit into the hippie scene at the time, and he looked the part. With long dark hair, kind eyes, and a floppy hat, he he often wore. Deborah was his girlfriend and had dark hair, brown eyes, and was always smiling in photos. Because the bodies had been exposed to the elements for 4 years, they needed to be identified by dental records. The zipper on James's pants was open in the same manner as it was for Joanne Walters, and autopsies revealed paralysing spinal wounds consistent with the previous discoveries. Word soon spread in the media that a serial killer was on the loose, sparking extra pressure on police to find a perpetrator. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Rod Milton was engaged to produce a profile of the killer, who he determined was in his mid-30s with a history of aggression, familiar with the landscape and area, and motivated by the pleasure of inflicting pain. Superintendent Clive Small was assigned in charge of the investigation, and a huge manual search of the Belanglo State Forest was declared underway. 21-year-old Simone Schmidl, known affectionately as Simmy, was a German backpacker, last seen hitchhiking in January of 1991. The alarm was raised when her mother came to visit her in Melbourne, but Simone was not at the airport to meet her. The distressed Mrs. Schmidl reported her daughter missing and stayed in Australia for 6 weeks before flying home to Europe, devastated and with no answers. Her daughter was described as adventurous and a confident lone traveller with a big smile, large glasses and a scarf, usually keeping her wild dark hair out of her face. On the 1st of November 1993, the police search uncovered a skeleton identified as Simone Schmidl. Her spine had been cut, and there were a number of stab wounds to the upper torso. Discarded .22 shells were nearby, as they were in the first murders. She was only partially dressed, with her shirt and underclothing pushed up around her neck. The cord ties on her green shorts were undone, and jewellery and coins were found next to her remains. In a tragic twist, her parents discovered over the radio that the remains of their daughter had been found, later having to contact German police to push for the confirmation of formal identification. The body count was now up to 5. German nationals Anja Habschied, 20, and her boyfriend, 21-year-old Gabor Nigebauer, were last seen on Boxing Day in 1991. The couple were happy, relaxed and carefree travellers, enjoying time together while in Australia. Anja had a thick head of red hair and a pretty smile. Gabor was described as handsome, with big brown eyes, a fit build, wavy brown hair and dimples. The young couple left a backpackers hostel in King's Cross, Sydney, with the intention of travelling to Adelaide, then on to Darwin. After Darwin, they planned to fly home, stopping in Asia along the way. In Anja's last letter home to family before Christmas, she wrote, "It will be a little difficult after Christmas because we'll need to travel the 4,100 kilometres to Darwin uninterrupted. The bad luck in Australia is that all you want to see lies so far from each other, and if you want to see something, you must spend a lot of money." 3 days after Simone Schmidl's remains were discovered, the search confirmed Australia's worst fears. There were still more bodies to be uncovered in Belanglo. Gabor had been strangled, his neck broken, and showing the telltale wounds that had severed his spinal column completely. He had been stabbed numerous times on his left and right sides, front and back. His jeans had been unzipped with the button refastened, once again echoing the fate of the previous victims. An airline ticket was found near the bodies. Horrifically, Anja had been decapitated in one blow with what appeared to be a sword or machete, and her skull was never found. Various independent reports and the criminal profile built by forensic psychiatrists had led the police to develop suspicions about a family that were locals in the area. It was a family with the surname Malat. These suspicions were soon focused on one member of the family. His name was Ivan. But despite their suspicions, they had no firm evidence linking Ivan Malat to the crimes. Matriarch of the Malat family, Margaret, was only 14 years old when she met 32-year-old Yugoslav immigrant Stephen Marco, in 1936. They married 2 years later, and by the age of 24, Margaret had given birth to 4 children: Olga, Alexander, Mary, and Boris. On the 27th of December, 1944, the couple welcomed a baby boy into the world, Ivan Robert Marco Malat. Margaret, Stephen, and the 5 children lived in a weatherboard cottage with a dirt floor in Bossley Park, some 36 kilometres west of Sydney. Stephen worked long night shifts as a wharf labourer to provide for his growing family. In total, the couple would have 9 more children. In the 1940s, the family was living on an acreage on Kelly Street in Rossmore, on the southwestern outskirts of Liverpool. Stephen converted the property so it was livable, and he worked as a gardener, selling vegetables and fruit to the Sydney market. He built a concrete shed, cut down trees to make room for garden beds, and bought a war surplus hut where the children slept on mattresses. The rural lifestyle meant that growing up, guns were a norm for the Malat siblings. By the time Alexander Malat was 8, he was using a shotgun to shoot birds around the property, and the brothers used air guns on each other while they played. Margaret and Stephen were known to be calm, yet conscientious of disciplining their children. However, Stephen's temper changed after the birth of Michael, their 8th child. He would get drunk and hit Margaret over the back of her head in front of the little ones if she nagged him about the drinking. Margaret also became abusive towards the children, especially Boris. She once hit him with a knife, gashing him, and on another occasion broke his arm with a tomato stake. The Malat children soon gained a reputation as troublemakers, as their parents struggled to control the unruly gang. They were often the subject of police attention. With little to do in the small town, the children made their own fun, and police became involved a number of times for housebreaking, car thefts, and armed robberies. But it seemed now that the crimes of at least one member of the family had escalated to something much more sinister than delinquency. During the period of time that the bodies were discovered, Ivan had been working on the roads for 16 years and was described as a friendly guy, always out washing his car or tending to his garden. He was the kind of neighbour who would call out to kids playing near the road to warn them of oncoming traffic. A profile based on a serial killer in Atlanta, USA, was used to narrow down characteristics in line with those of the Malat family. A family familiar with the forest landscape, previous criminal convictions, many siblings, and a love of guns. This led police to gather information on Ivan that contradicted the nice guy reports. According to previous girlfriends, he was gun-obsessed, had a powerful 4-wheel drive, and most notably, was a complete control freak. As the investigation into Ivan progressed, it was quickly determined that he was unaccounted for around the dates that the backpackers disappeared. Even more intriguing to police was the fact that he had previously been accused and stood trial for abducting and raping 2 women when he was 27. It was claimed by the pair that they were taken by Malat at knife point while near the town of Bowral, an area known to be frequented by Malat and only a 30-minute drive from Belanglo State Forest. In the early 70s, Malat stood trial for the abduction and assault, but he was acquitted on the charges when the prosecution failed to make a good enough case against him. Another alleged attack also occurred 6 years after, in 1977, on 2 18-year-old hitchhikers. The hitchhikers didn't report the attempted kidnapping at the time, but it later came to light, and police were now sure that these crimes were linked to their current investigation. The exact extent of Malat's earlier attacks remained unknown, but one survivor's story was confirmed and later proved as a catalyst to break the case wide open. On the 25th of January 1990, British backpacker Paul Onions was hitchhiking south of Sydney in search of work. A driver pulled up in a 4-wheel drive and offered him a ride on the side of the Hume Highway. Introducing himself as Bill, the driver appeared friendly and threw many questions Paul's way as they drove. Bill mentioned to Paul that he worked on the roads, lived near Liverpool, and was from a Yugoslavian family. Paul grew anxious after the friendly chat turned to racist, agitated remarks and became concerned for his safety when Bill's driving became erratic. Eventually he slowed down and stopped the vehicle, claiming he needed to retrieve some audio tapes from the rear of the car. It was then he produced a black revolver and pointed it at Paul. In the words of Paul, he pulled out a black revolver. I jumped out of the car and ran. He chased me, and I jumped in front of a car. The lady driving stopped the car, and she took me to Bowral Police Station. Paul Onions returned to his homeland of England, still disturbed by the experience. But it was not until Malat's alleged involvement in the backpacker murders became international news a few years later that he realised just how narrow his escape was. The international media interest proved helpful when Paul Onions, the only known victim of Ivan Milat to escape, contacted Australian authorities in April of 1994. He shared with police information about his 1990 attack. His account was further corroborated by an independent call from the woman who had rescued Paul and driven him to the police station. Police recognised quickly that if Paul Onions could identify Milat as his attacker, then they could perhaps tie him to the other murders. Paul Onions was flown out to Australia, where he positively identified Ivan Milat from a video lineup, giving police the grounds they needed to seek a warrant for the search of various Milat properties. A simultaneous raid was carried out in the early hours of the 22nd of May 1994. This revealed a huge amount of evidence linking Milat to the crimes. 2 sleeping bags were found in a wardrobe and were later identified as belonging to Simone Schmidl and Deborah Everest. Ivan Milat's work bag was found to contain a Bowie-style knife and also an owner's manual for a Ruger .22 caliber rifle. In his garage, a nylon sleeping bag cover was found, containing a rolled tent and a purple headband, identical to the one found around Simone Schmidl's skull. The ceiling of the garage had a manhole in which gun parts were found in a plastic bag underneath insulation in a wall cavity. Among these parts was a breech bolt, which was proved to be from the gun that shot Gabor Nijabau and Caroline Clark. Police also discovered electrical tape, cable ties, and a bag of yellow and blue ropes similar to those found at the crime scenes. A water canteen with the name Simi scratched onto the bottom was found, along with a camera that proved to belong to Caroline Clark. The search also located rifles, shotguns, knives, crossbows, and a huge amount of ammunition, and nearly all the camp gear belonging to the murdered victims. Possibly the most disturbing discovery was a long curved cavalry sword, assumed to have been used in the beheading of Anya Habshid. It was found in a locked cupboard at the home of Ivan Milat's mother. Following these raids, Milat was quickly arrested and taken into custody for questioning. During this time, he was evasive and uncooperative. He was initially charged with the attack on Paul Onions, then subsequently with the 7 murders, once ballistic evidence matched his weapon to the attacks. On the 27th of July, 1996, Milat was found guilty of all murders and the attempted murder of Paul Onions. He was given a life sentence for each count, to be served back-to-back and without the possibility of parole. While in prison, Ivan Milat turned to self-mutilation in an attempt to jumpstart his appeal to the High Court in Sydney. He hoped that by swallowing razor blades, staples, and a spring from a toilet mechanism, and periodically starving himself, would get the judge's attention and maybe get the process moving a little faster. In 2009, he hacked off his pinky finger with a plastic knife and handed it to guards in an envelope padded with newspaper. It was addressed to the High Court of Australia. In 2011, he lost 25 kilograms, hunger striking, in an unsuccessful attempt to obtain a PlayStation in his cell. Ivan Robert Marco Milat has been locked up in Goulburn's Supermax jail for over 20 years. After Milat's capture, conviction, and sentence, it soon came to light that he displayed disturbing behaviour from a very young age. Police had known about the Milat children's burglaries, car thefts, and armed robberies, but they were unaware that as a teenager, Ivan Milat had made a lesser-known attempt to kill in 1962. This story was revealed by Milat's older brother Boris in 2015. Late one night, the then 17-year-old Milat hopped into the back of a cab near his home in Moorebank in Sydney's west. The driver was unsuspecting retired Navy Morse code expert Neville Knight. Without a word, Milat quietly pressed a shotgun to the back of Neville's seat and pulled the trigger, sending an explosion of pellets through the seat and into his spine. Ivan's brother Boris shared the knowledge of the encounter to the Sunday night program on Channel 7 in 2015. He stated the bloke straight away knew he had lost everything in his bottom end. He knew it went through his back. He knew Ivan had paralysed him. This inflicted paralysis could have been a sign of what was to come, a sickening signature to render victims helpless so they could stay alive and suffer. Ivan had relayed this story to his brother the day after the attack, but Boris hadn't reported it, even when another man was wrongfully convicted of the crime and spent 5 years behind bars. Not only did the serial killings of Ivan Milat leave a dark stain on the tourism landscape of the 90s, but his horrific attacks have been referenced a number of times in popular culture. The 2005 Australian horror film Wolf Creek is partially based on the backpacker murders. It follows the story of 3 backpackers who find themselves abducted, brutally tortured, raped, and hunted down by a vicious Australian in the outback. Some may say the seed of evil was sown in Ivan Milat's upbringing, in broken relationships or a troubled childhood. Another element that has been blamed was the fact he was never in a stable relationship when the murders occurred. His signature severing of his victim's spinal cords suggests the need for complete control, megalomania, and obsession with exercising power. Police believe there may have been 3 or 4 more victims, but Ivan Milat has never confessed or admitted any involvement in the murders. Tragically, additional horror lies in the crimes not known, the bodies not found, the answers not given, and the buried knowledge of a controlling sadistic psychopath now 72 years old.
Now to the day's top report, the discovery of 2 more backpacker murder victims in the Belanglo State Forest near Bowral. The bodies are believed to be those of German tourist Gabor Neugebauer and his 19-year-old girlfriend Anya Habshib. They are the 6th and 7th murder victims to be uncovered in the forest. Their bodies were found during a police line search of thick bushland only a kilometre east of the spot where Simone Schmidt...
Thanks for listening. In a first for Felon, this episode was researched and written by someone other than myself. Credit for that goes to Madeline Williams Ritchie, who has put in a huge effort researching the case and penning the script. If you've liked what you've heard in this episode or in the previous episodes, please help us out by rating and reviewing in iTunes or your favourite listening app. You can reach Felon on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter at Felon True Crime. And now you can even join the group Friends of Felon True Crime on Facebook.
G'day. I don't want to interrupt you while you're packing for your holiday down under, but there's one thing I forgot to mention. The language barrier. You see, Australia is the world's biggest island, and as you can appreciate, the accent varies noticeably from one place to another. For instance, down south in historic Hobart, you'll find they greet you like this.
G'day.
Whereas on the west coast, you can detect the Mediterranean influence.
G'day.
Of course, in sun-drenched Queensland, you'll come across the more tropical greeting.
G'day.
While in the great Australian outback,
G'day.
as opposed to the smooth sophistication of our cosmopolitan cities.
G'day.
Now, if you want to know more about Australia, you can get a free copy of the Aussie Holiday Book just by picking up the phone, saying, G'day.
G'day, Paul.
Try it with a smile, mate.
G'day, Paul.
Smooth as a gravy sandwich. From Arizona, aren't you?
Oh, long time.
It's got the pub there.
Come and say g'day.